My name is Detective Pierce. Some places cling to you long before you've ever set foot in them. They whisper across newspapers, through faded photographs, in drunken stories told by sailors who can't look you in the eye. That's how I first heard of Grayharbor, a port town tucked against the North Sea, a place always described with too much fog and too little warmth. Grayharbor wasn't marked by industry or commerce. Its shipping lanes had been abandoned decades ago, once larger ports outpaced it. What remained was a town dwindling on its own bones, propped up by fish markets, a few tourist traps that only opened in summer, and the kind of folklore that wrapped around its residents like chains. One story in particular caught my ear, a man who rose from the sea when storms rolled in. They called him the Black Mariner. No one could tell me his real name, or if he'd ever had one. Some said he was a sailor drowned in a shipwreck a century ago, condemned to stalk the shoreline. Others swore he was no man at all, something older, something born of salt and bone. The legends varied, but the threads were consistent. Whenever the Black Mariner appeared, someone disappeared soon after. Normally, I would have dismissed it. But Grayharbor had a problem. In the past 6 months, 3 townsfolk had gone missing. No ransom notes, no traces, nothing but their absence. The disappearances all coincided with nights of heavy storms. Each time, people swore they saw a figure walk up from the crashing waves, leaving wet footprints that steamed in the cold air. The local police chalked it up to bad weather, maybe smugglers, maybe runaway drunks. But a friend in the regional constabulary asked me to take a closer look. And so I found myself driving into Grayharbor one overcast afternoon, my coat collar pulled high, the smell of salt and rot already thick in the wind. The town looked as though it had been painted in shades of gray and left to peel. Wooden houses with chipped paint leaned toward one another, their windows dim with curtains always half drawn. Narrow streets twisted downhill toward the docks, where boats bobbed weakly, ropes creaking like tired joints. I parked near the town's only inn, the Breakwater Arms. The sign swung lazily, the painted letters so faded you had to squint to read them. Inside, it smelled of old wood, fried fish, and dampness that had never dried. The innkeeper, a woman in her 50s with skin like parchment, and eyes like tide pools, gave me the look reserved for strangers, not hostile, but not welcoming either. "You'll want a room, I expect," she said flatly, sliding a heavy brass key across the counter. "Best to keep the window latched at night." I paused, watching her face for a flicker of humor, but there was none. "Because of the storms?" Her lips thinned. "Because of what comes with them." I carried my bag upstairs, her words sitting like lead in my pocket. That evening, I wandered down toward the harbor. The sea was restless, dark waves pushing against the pier with dull booms. The air had that electric taste storms bring, though the sky hadn't yet split open. Fishermen were roping down their boats, tying them with a nervous haste. I stopped one of them, a hunched man with a beard that looked like driftwood. "Rough weather coming?" He glanced at me, then at the horizon. "Weather's the least of it. You're not from here, are you?" "No." He spat into the water. "Figures. Outsiders don't last long if they linger. When the wind howls, you stay indoors. Doesn't matter if your roof leaks or the walls shake, don't go out. And if you hear someone calling your name from the shore," he trailed off, fingers tightening on the rope, "don't answer." I asked about the Black Mariner, but he shook his head, muttering something in a dialect too tangled for me to catch. He pulled his collar high and left without another word. The first droplets of rain began to fall as I returned to the inn. By the time I closed my door behind me, thunder was rolling across the sea. That night the storm came. Wind clawed at the shutters, rattling them like skeletal fingers. Rain hammered the roof with the fury of 1,000 fists. I lay awake, listening. Somewhere beneath the roar of the storm, I thought I heard something else. A low, rhythmic sound, like footsteps slapping against soaked wood. Curiosity won. I rose, careful not to let the floorboards groan, and cracked the window. The rain had blurred the world into shifting shadows. The docks swayed in the distance, ropes straining, lanterns swinging wildly. And there, moving slowly along the pier, was a figure. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long, black coat that hung heavy with water. His head was covered by a hood, but even from here I could see his face was obscured by a glistening mask of wet, matted hair. His steps left prints that shimmered white, as though the salt in them burned against the wood. I leaned forward, heart pounding, when suddenly, he stopped. His head tilted, slow and deliberate, as though he'd felt my gaze. The storm bellowed, lightning forked across the sky, and for an instant his features lit up. They weren't human. His eyes glowed pale, like lanterns left deep underwater. His mouth was a jagged line, lips split and torn, salt water dripping like blood. Then darkness swallowed him again. When I blinked, the pier was empty. But the footprints remained, and they were leading straight toward town. I'll pause here. What I saw that night wasn't a drunk fisherman wandering in the storm, nor some trick of the light. It was real. And if the stories were true, it meant Grayharbor was about to bleed again. I locked my window, set my revolver on the bedside table, and forced myself to sit in the chair until dawn. Sleep never came. The storm did not take the night alone. By morning, a woman was missing. Her name was Lydia Merrow, and she'd lived 2 streets away from the inn. Her door had been found ajar, her boots still by the hearth. The only sign of her leaving was a trail of wet, salty footprints leading out into the rain. The Black Mariner had claimed another, and I was already in the middle of it. Morning in Grayharbor arrived reluctantly, dragging itself through torn clouds and sea mist. The streets were still slick from the storm, puddles shining like oil in the weak daylight. I stepped outside the inn with the weight of salt already pressing against my lungs, as if the sea had decided to crawl inland during the night. The town was stirring, but in hushed tones. Doors opened only halfway, conversations cut short when I passed. Fear had a way of settling into communities like this, tight-knit, old, suspicious of outsiders. And now it had a name to whisper in every kitchen and tavern: Lydia Merrow. I found her house easily. It was a squat building of gray stone and wood, huddled close to the shore. A constable stood by the door, his hat pulled low, his face ruddy from the wind. He looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "You Pierce?" he asked, voice rough. "Yes." "You must be Constable Reddick." He nodded once, curt. "Wish I could say it's a pleasure, but I reckon you already heard the news." "Lydia Merrow," I said. His eyes flicked toward the door. Widow, lived alone. Never had trouble, never stirred the pot. People liked her well enough." He shifted on his boots. "No one saw her leave. But the trail." He let the words hang. "Footprints," I finished. He swallowed, nodded again. "Come inside. Best you see for yourself." The house smelled faintly of seaweed and smoke. A kettle sat cold on the stove, mugs lying neatly on a shelf. Boots by the hearth, unworn, dry. A shawl lay folded on the chair, as though Lydia had planned to return and simply hadn't. But the door was ajar, and on the floor near it, a trail of wet prints glistened faintly. They weren't muddy or bloody, but salt white, crystalline around the edges as though the water itself was wrong. The tracks led out, toward the street. "Neighbors heard nothing?" I asked. "Storm covered most sounds," Reddick said. "But one woman claims she heard singing. Low, like a chant carried on the wind. My stomach tightened. And you believe her? He stared at the prince, his jaw working. After last night, I believe more than I want to. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, the way people always do when tragedy strikes someone else's door. Faces pinched with cold, with suspicion. I felt their eyes follow me as I stepped out of Lydia's home. Among them was a woman in a heavy shawl, her hair streaked with silver. She looked older than the rest, but her eyes were sharp, unclouded. "You're the detective," she said, voice steady. "Yes." She studied me a moment, then leaned closer. "You won't find her. Not if the mariner took her." "You believe that story?" I asked. Her mouth curved, not into a smile but into something sharper. "Believe? I've lived long enough to watch it happen. Every generation loses someone. Always in the storm. Always the same trail of salt. The Black Mariner is not a tale to scare children, he's a debt come due." "A debt?" She glanced toward the sea, where the waves crashed against the breakwater. "This town was built on bargains. You'll hear talk of shipwrecks, of cursed treasure pulled from the deep. But the truth? Grayharbor stole from the sea. Took what wasn't theirs. And the sea takes back in kind." Before I could ask more, she melted into the crowd, leaving the words heavy in my chest. I spent the afternoon walking the docks. Fishermen worked with their heads down, nets heavy with catch, ropes creaking under strain. Every man I spoke to avoided my questions, muttering half-answers before hurrying off. Superstition held their tongues tighter than law ever could. But one finally cracked. A boy no older than 16, face freckled, eyes darting nervously. He'd been mending nets when I approached. "You don't want to ask about him," he whispered, glancing around to be sure no one heard. "The Black Mariner don't like his name spoken." "What happens if you do?" I asked. The boy's throat bobbed. "He hears you. And then he follows. And has anyone ever come back after he takes them?" The boy shook his head, lips trembling. They say he drags them beneath, into the black halls of the sea. Where you walk forever, but never breathe." His hands fumbled with the rope, knotting it wrong. He cursed under his breath, then looked at me. "Don't stay after dark. Not unless you want him to notice you." That evening, as the sky bruised into twilight, I returned to the inn. The innkeeper met me at the door, her hands wringing a towel. "You went poking where you shouldn't," she said. "It's my job," I replied. She sighed, as though I'd missed the point. "Lydia's gone. You won't bring her back. Best thing for you is to pack up, take the morning coach, and forget you ever came." "Not an option," I said. Her gaze hardened. "Then keep your lamp burning at night. And don't open the door. No matter what voice you hear calling from outside." With that, she turned sharply, disappearing into the kitchen. Night settled over Grayharbor like a heavy shroud. The wind picked up, rattling signs and shutters. Though the sea hadn't yet boiled into storm, the air carried a dampness that felt anticipatory, like the breath before a scream. I sat by the window in my room, watching the street below. At first it was empty, silent. But then movement. A lone figure walked slowly up the cobbled lane. Tall, wrapped in a coat dripping wet despite the dry air. Each step left behind that faint, shimmering trace of salt. My pulse spiked. I opened the window just enough to hear. And there it was, a voice, low and ragged, carrying words I couldn't understand. A chant, or a dirge shaped by the sea itself. Then, like a knife through the dark, it shifted. Pierce. My name. The figure had stopped in the street, head tilted toward my window. The syllables rolled from its mouth, wet and guttural, like a drowning man learning speech. Pierce. My throat dried. Logic told me to shut the window, to step back, to ignore it. But something primal in me wanted to respond, to lean out into the night and acknowledge it. That urge was strong, terrifyingly strong. I clenched my jaw and pulled the window shut. The figure lingered another moment, then drifted down the street, vanishing into fog. But the name still clung to the air like rot. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that I had been marked. The next morning, another house stood empty. This time, a fisherman named Garrick Hale. His wife swore he'd been asleep beside her. She woke to the sound of footsteps and the smell of salt. By the time she lit the lamp, the bed was empty. And in the doorway, the same trail of footprints. The Black Mariner had taken another. And now he knew mine. The morning air carried a strange silence, as though the sea itself was holding its breath. Grayharbor looked unchanged to an untrained eye. Boats creaked at the docks, gulls cried overhead, but the townsfolk moved differently. Shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, words spoken only in whispers. 2 taken in 2 nights. Lydia Merrill, then Garrick Hale. The Black Mariner's shadow was no longer folklore. It was fact. And I could feel its weight on me like a noose tightening. I decided that if answers existed, they would be found not in gossip, but at the water's edge. Every story, every whisper pointed there. The docks were busier than I expected. Fishermen mending nets, hauling barrels, their eyes sharp with fear but their hands unwilling to rest. To stop working was to starve, and starvation was a slower death than the sea's embrace. I walked until the last of the new wood gave way to weathered planks, bleached gray and brittle with salt. Beyond lay the old docks, half-rotted skeletons of piers that jutted into the water like broken teeth. Most avoided this stretch. But I had no choice. The tide was low, revealing barnacle-crusted pylons and slick stone. As I moved further down the abandoned pier, I noticed something carved into the wood. At first glance, it looked like the ordinary graffiti of sailors, initials, crude marks, but the more I studied, the clearer it became. Symbols. Circles intersecting with jagged lines, marks like waves splitting apart, and a recurring shape, a figure with arms outstretched, crowned by what could only be the sea. The same sigil repeated, always facing the water, always etched deep as though meant to endure storms and years alike. The hairs on the back of my neck bristled. These weren't idle carvings. They were words, prayers, warnings. A voice broke my thoughts. "You shouldn't be here." I turned. An old man stood at the end of the pier, his back stooped, beard wild and salt white. He carried a basket of fish that smelled days too old. His eyes, pale and clouded, stared not at me but through me, as though seeing something else entirely. "You know these symbols?" I asked. He shuffled closer, set the basket down, and crouched beside the markings. His gnarled fingers traced one of the circles with reverence. "These keep him at bay," he whispered. "Least they used to." "The Black Mariner?" At the name, his shoulders twitched. "Best not to speak it so freely. He's been walking these shores longer than any of us. The sea gives, the sea takes, and he's the hand that carries the debt." I crouched beside him. "Why now? Why take Lydia and Garrick?" The old man's mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. "Because the town forgot its bargain. Greed makes men blind, detective. They pulled too much from the sea, dredged up things they shouldn't. The mariner doesn't like imbalance. So he comes. Always he comes." His words sank into me like hooks. "And the footprints? The salt?" The old man's eyes finally locked onto mine, sharp despite their cloudiness. "That's no salt, boy. That's what's left when the sea takes what belongs to it. The trace of the drowned. I left him there, muttering to the waves, his basket of rotten fish attracting gulls. The rest of the day brought little comfort. Each corner of Grayharbor seemed touched by unease. Children ushered indoors, shutters nailed tighter, sailors drinking more heavily than usual. And every time I glanced toward the horizon, I swore I saw a shape in the fog, tall, still, watching. When dusk bled across the town, I found myself standing before the church. Or what passed for one. It was small, stone-built, with a crooked steeple. Inside, candles flickered weakly against damp walls, the air reeking of mildew and incense. A priest greeted me, thin, hollow-eyed, his hands shaking as he lit another candle. "You seek shelter?" he asked. "Answers," I said. His laugh was brittle. "You won't find them here. God turned his face from this place long ago." I studied him. "Then why stay?" His gaze dropped to the floor. "Because if I leave, there will be no one left to pray for the drowned." I pressed further. "You believe this black mariner is real?" "Believe?" He nearly choked on the word. "I've seen him. Once years ago. A storm worse than last night's. I stood at this very door, watching the sea devour ship's hull, and there he was, walking across the waves as if they were solid ground. His coat was torn, his hat dripping, and the faces of the drowned clung to his back like barnacles. He did not look at me, and I did not speak his name. That is why I'm still here." His voice dropped lower. "If he's returned, detective, then your investigation is already lost. The sea does not bargain twice." I left the church unsettled, the priest's words gnawing at me. Yet doubt had no room now, not after Lydia, not after Garrick. The Black Mariner wasn't a story. He was here. That night, the storm broke again. Rain hammered the rooftops, wind shrieked down the narrow streets. My lamp flickered wildly in the room, shadows twisting into cruel shapes on the walls. And then came the knock. 3 raps, deliberate, heavy. I froze, every nerve burning. The innkeeper's warning rang in my mind, "Don't open the door. No matter what voice you hear." The knock came again. Then, her voice. "Pierce." It was Lydia Merrow. I knew it, with the same certainty that I knew my own heartbeat. Her tone, her cadence. But it was wrong. Stretched, waterlogged, each syllable dragging like kelp in a current. "Pierce. Help me." My hand hovered over the latch. Logic screamed no. Instinct begged yes. I clenched my teeth, forcing my body back. "You're not her," I said aloud, though my voice shook. Silence. Then a low, wet chuckle. The sound receded down the hall, footsteps dripping as they went. I collapsed back into the chair, heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. The mariner wasn't knocking for someone else anymore. He had come for me. I didn't sleep that night. The storm pressed its weight against the windows, the walls shuddered like lungs gasping, and every creak of the inn felt like a step outside my door. By dawn, the world beyond was washed gray, soaked in rain and silence. Grayharbor was empty. Or at least it seemed so. The streets were slick, gutters choked with seaweed, shutters rattling in the wind. The townsfolk hid inside, their fear thicker than the fog rolling off the waves. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed leverage. If the mariner was tied to some bargain, then bargains had terms. And terms could be broken, or twisted. The town records sat in the mayor's house, a crumbling manse on the hill overlooking the harbor. Its stone walls were black with rot, its gates sagging, but within those ledgers I hoped to find what the priest and the old fisherman could not give me, the truth of the debt. Mayor Alcott himself met me at the door, his face pale from sleepless nights. He was a large man once, but his weight had melted into sagging flesh. His hands trembled as he ushered me in. "You've heard them, haven't you?" he asked in a whisper. "Heard who?" "The voices. At the windows. In the rain." His eyes darted to the glass. "They come every night now. Some call for their kin, others only laugh. I know their faces, detective. All of them were townsfolk once." I didn't answer. I only gestured toward the shelves of ledgers and maps in the adjoining room. "I need the records. Shipping manifests, town charters, anything concerning the harbor." His lips tightened, but he nodded. Hours passed as I sifted through mold-eaten paper, ink smeared by damp. Most were mundane accounts, taxes, trade, fish harvests, but then I found it. A charter dated 1792, signed by the founders of Grayharbor. It was no ordinary charter. Scrawled at the bottom, beneath the mayor's ornate signature, were marks I recognized from the docks: circles, jagged waves, the crowned figure. A pact. The words accompanying it chilled me. "We offer unto the deep a portion, that the rest may flourish. In salt we bind, in silence we promise. The tide shall feed us, if we feed it in kind." Beneath, a ledger of names. Every decade another. Dozens upon dozens. Some crossed through, others left untouched. Sacrifices. I turned to Alcott, who stood wringing his hands. "You've been feeding him." His eyes watered. "Not me. Not only me. All of us. The founders made the pact, and each mayor after carried it on. We kept the balance, one every decade, chosen in secret. A life given so the rest could prosper. But greed." "Lydia," I said flatly. He nodded, shame heavy in the motion. "She was meant to be the offering this decade. Young, strong, without kin to protest. But her family refused. They hid her. The town let it pass. Too many feared what the pact meant. We thought perhaps it was over. But it wasn't. No. He came for her anyway. And when he found her, he took Garrick besides. To punish us. To remind us." The room felt suddenly colder, as if the sea itself had seeped through the stone walls. "You let this happen," I said, voice low. "You let generations die to protect your own." His gaze hardened. "And what would you have done, detective? Let the sea take the whole town. Better one than all. That was always the way." His words struck, cruel in their logic. But before I could speak again, a sound rose outside. A horn. Long, low, like a ship's call, but no ship remained in the harbor. The mayor's face strained of color. "He's here." We ran to the windows. The fog that blanketed the sea now rolled into the town itself, thick and heavy. And from within it came shapes, figures staggering up the streets, their bodies twisted, clothes dripping. Faces bloated, pale, mouths spilling seawater. The drowned. The mayor collapsed to his knees, weeping. "He's calling his court." I grabbed his arm. "Is there a way to end it?" He only shook his head, muttering prayers. Then the drowned reached the first door. They didn't knock, they pressed their sodden hands against it, and the wood rotted black beneath their touch. The house gave way, collapsing inward, screams lost in the fog. The mariner didn't need to enter every home. His servants did it for him. I bolted from the manor. The streets were chaos, doors slamming, windows shuttering, the drowned shambling with unnatural purpose. I ducked into an alley, my coat catching on rusted nails, breath harsh in my ears. That was when I saw him. At the edge of the harbor, where land met sea, the fog parted. Tall. Silent. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, water pouring endlessly from his coat. His steps left trails of salt that burned through the cobblestone. The Black Mariner. And though his head never turned, I felt his gaze anchor on me, pulling like a tide. My pulse hammered. My instinct screamed to run. But my feet stayed rooted. Because the sea does not chase. It waits. And it had marked me. I tore my eyes away, stumbling back into the shadows. My mind clawed for sense, for escape, for anything. The pact. The ledger. The names. The mariner did not take at random. He took what was owed. And if Lydia was chosen but withheld, then she was not the only one on his list. I pulled the ledger from my coat where I had stuffed it earlier. My eyes raced the columns, past decades of the dead, until I reached the latest entries. 3 names glowed faintly against the ink, as though the salt had burned through the page. Lydia Merrow, Garrick Hale, and mine, Detective Pierce. The paper slipped from my hands. The Black Mariner had already chosen. My name burned on the page as though etched in salt. Detective Pierce. The ledger trembled in my hand, but I knew it wasn't the storm or the wind. It was the sea itself, reaching through ink and paper, laying its claim. Outside, Grayharbor was unraveling. The drowned marched through the streets like a grotesque procession, their hollow eyes reflecting lantern light as they pulled screaming townsfolk into the mist. Doors buckled, roofs sagged beneath invisible tides, and all the while the low horn moaned, as ships call without a vessel. The mariner waited by the shore, silent, patient, inevitable. I stumbled back to the mayor. Alcott was crumpled on the floor, his lips moving in prayer, but there was no faith left in his eyes. "You knew this day would come," I spat. "You hid it behind talk of balance, of sacrifice, but you knew the debt would grow. You knew the sea always takes its due." He raised his tear-streaked face, voice hoarse. "There is no stopping him. Only delaying. Only appeasing. And you expected me to accept my place on his list?" He didn't answer. His silence was the truth. The ledger weighed in my hands like an anchor. If the pact was bound in names, then perhaps it could be broken the same way. I ripped the page. Salt stung my fingertips, the ink bleeding like fresh wounds. The moment the parchment tore, the horn outside wailed louder, furious. The drowned stopped their march. Every head turned toward the mayor's house. And then they screamed. It was no human sound. 1,000 mouths opening at once, pouring seawater and sorrow into the air. Glass shattered, wood splintered, stone cracked beneath the force. I dropped the page, my ears ringing, blood trickling from my nose. The mayor clutched at me. "Fool! You've broken the seal. He'll take the whole town. Then maybe it's time Grayharbor paid its debt in full." I ran. Out into the storm, into the choking fog. The drowned closed in, their hands reaching, nails black with rot. I shoved past them, their touch leaving burning welts on my arms, until I reached the docks. There he was. The mariner stood at the water's edge, taller than any man, the brim of his hat dripping with endless rain. His face was still hidden, but I felt his eyes, a depthless pull, the promise of drowning stretched across eternity. In his hand he held a chain, and at the end of it, a lantern burned with blue fire, swaying with the storm. Within its glow, I saw faces, Lydia, Garrick, and countless others, mouths open in silent screams. Their souls trapped, their dead eternal. He lifted the lantern toward me. An offer. My body shook, lungs burning from salt and fear. If I stepped forward, I knew I would join them. If I refused, perhaps the entire town would sink beneath the tide. But then I remembered the pact's words. "In salt we bind, in silence we promise." It was not just the sea that had bound the town, it was the town that had bound itself. I shouted into the storm. "No more silence!" and I hurled the torn ledger into the harbor. The sea convulsed. Waves rose like walls, the fog tearing apart in violent gusts. The lantern in the mariner's hand flared, the faces inside twisting, screaming, not in pain, but in release. For the first time, the mariner moved. His head tilted back, and I glimpsed beneath the hat. Not a face. Not flesh. Only a hollow void filled with stars, a night sky drowned beneath black water. The lantern shattered. Souls burst free like sparks into the rain, scattering across the waves. The drowned collapsed, their bodies crumbling to salt and driftwood. And the mariner, he stepped backward into the surf. The tide swallowed him without a ripple, as though he had never been there at all. When silence fell, it was heavier than any storm. Grayharbor was broken, homes shattered, streets flooded, but alive. The townsfolk emerged slowly, staring at the sea in fearful awe. The mayor found me at the docks, his face gray, his eyes hollow. "You've doomed us," he whispered. "No," I said, though my voice wavered. "I freed you. The pact is broken. The debt is paid." But even as I spoke, I wasn't sure. For when I glanced at the water, I thought I saw him, just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The sea does not forget. And I knew then that though I had escaped his list, I had not escaped his gaze. I left Grayharbor at dawn. The storm had passed, but the horizon was dark, and the waves carried whispers only I seemed to hear. The case was closed. But the sea had marked me. And one day, when the tide rose high enough, I feared I would hear the horn again, calling only for me.